Carlo D'Amore. D'Amore.
D'amore.
D'Amore.
D'amore.
Thanks for being here. I wanted to
My
really talk
pleasure.
with you about your work in theater, your work in storytelling, and also the fact that you're directing Reel One with
Yeah,
Ian Eaton. So tell
bring
us
it
something
on.
about your theater work and your theater project.
Awesome. I will. Thanks a lot. First of all, thank you so much for giving me the space to do one of my favorite things, which is talk about myself. Just kidding. So those are big questions. So my theater, I started as an actor, which I think is pretty normal. I think most of us start as actors a very long time ago. It was the first thing actually ever did in school. The only subject where the teacher was like, "Oh, look at Carlo. Do what Carlo's doing." Because I was a pretty bad student. But it was the first time that I actually felt like, "Oh, I could do something." And that was in high school. But I think my storytelling comes from way before. I think I come from a long line of storytellers. My mom, my uncles, certainly on my mom's side of the family. Um, and my learning years were in California in the Bay Area. That's where I got my start as a professional actor. And you can't tell from looking at me, maybe you can. I'm pretty short, so 5'6", which is short for a man. So I got a lot of young parts. So, and I looked very, very young. So I always played the male ingenue for a very long time until late into my 20s. I was playing teenagers, and which was awesome because I got to bring a little more maturity to those roles. But that's how I got my start in San Francisco, which is a great place to be an actor, to like train. I had a mentor one-on-one, which was really, really rare. It's rare today. An incredible actor who just took me under his wing, and I was so confused. I was such a horrible student. I'm sure, but that's how I started, a professional actor. And when I was 26, I wanted much more, and I've always known the theater, so the theater it's accessible, as opposed to film and television. Even though I've worked in film and television as an actor and most recently as a filmmaker, the theater's easy. You can just do it anywhere. You don't need all the equipment. You don't need all that stuff. So I moved to New York when I was 26. And I started much bigger pond. I auditioned. I got on Broadway a couple of times as a non-singer, which is a pretty big deal, I think. And then I just started making my own work. I was just too impatient to wait for somebody to give me a work. So I started telling stories, telling very personal stories. And I did a couple of one-man shows. One of them, No Parole, which is a really fascinating story. I turned that into a one-man show, and I played, ran it, for first 15 minutes, and kind of the way Ian and worked on Real One, which is a very organic way of working. You have 5 minutes, and then you have 10 minutes, and then you have a half an hour, and then you have a whole hour, and then you have a little bit longer than an hour. It's a one-man show. Um, I'm actually turning my first one-man show into a television series because it's so much story.
Can I
But
ask you a question? Can I bring it back to something? Because I think you
please,
you grabbed my attention right in the beginning. You said you come from a family of storytellers.
yeah.
What kind of stories did you hear growing up? What impacted you?
That's so funny. So it's gonna get yeah, and interrupt me because I mean it's I'll just keep talking. So definitely interrupt me. My mom was a born storyteller, and which is hilarious because she turned that ability all kinds of different stories. She could she would break our hearts. She would tell these stories and have all of us just sobbing uncontrollably. For Halloween, she had a really thick mane of hair, and she would rat it out. She'd become this witch, and oh my God, it was so terrifying. One of her brothers, I'll never forget. We were in this big house. I was born in Peru, Lima, in this big, huge colonial style house. And my uncle was on the second floor in that corner over there with a flashlight underneath his chin. And me and my brother and like seven of our friends were little. We were in the living room couch. And he started to spin. Now I know he was improvising the whole thing. He was making it all up on the fly, but it was this web about the rats and the mice living underneath the house and this battle. And he had a flashlight and his chin, and he had a hose, and he was using it as a whip. Oh my God, it was so terrifying. My brother, who was kind of scaredy cat, he ran out of the house and ran through the glass door. He was so terrified. There's a cut out of his body going through the glass door. They just told stories all the time. Told stories to make people laugh, told stories, embellished things a lot, you know. It's so funny. My one man show is about my mom. My mom, well, amongst many other things, was an international con artist. So she literally became different personas. She had multiple aliases. She was turning her storytelling into, you know, selling you a pipe dream and you bought it because she was so good at it.
Well, that's a whole story that we need to
Yeah,
get
and
into at
we
some
could be
point.
there for 5 hours. Yeah.
Yeah, I would really, I'd love to hear that. My mother, I guess your mother was Italian?
My mother was fourth generation Peruvian, but of heavy Italian roots. There's a lot of Italians that going back to the conquistador times. There are Italians within the Spanish conquistadors, of course, and so there's a big population of Italians living in Peru. So she comes from that ilk. But there's also like, Native American, Native African in our roots. Yeah, my father was 100% Italian, Neapolitan, and they met in Peru. Was born there, and I lived there until I was 10, and then we moved to California. We migrated to California in 79.
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, you brought up just a memory since we're talking about stories and mothers. My mother was also a great storyteller, and
Yeah.
and they were mostly from her life. She wasn't like your mother, that
Yeah.
creative, but she would sit you down and tell you stories of growing up, her tragic life. She died young. Really impacted me. You know, I
Yeah.
and so I think that you're making me think
Think
about
like a punk. Yeah.
the
I
root
think
the roots of storytelling in one's what
yeah.
you hear from one's mother.
And I think this maybe is doesn't need to be said, but I think older generations, because we didn't have, I remember at one point my mom and my sibling, my little brother and little sister were in Italy, and they were living in this attic, and we didn't have enough money for them, and they were kind of like hiding out. It was big saga, but there was no TV. And my little brother and sister were like, they were bored, and my brother and sister still tell me, my mother passed away, unfortunately, a few years ago, but they tell me stories of how for the span of about a year that they were in Rome, my mom would tell this story every night. It was a soap opera that she was telling, and it kept turning and twisting, and because they're entertaining people. So like older generations, because they didn't have, the storytelling is just something that you did when you got around, around the fire, when you got around the table, because you didn't have TV, you didn't have technology, so you had to be creative, and it just became an extension of your life, I think, I mean, that's how I started making theater, aside from my solo work. I have a company called Live in Theater, and that company has been around for 16 years. And I started the bulk of our work is true crime. That's where I come from, right? So it's all connected. It's just the stories, I take in that for that company, Live in Theater, I take real cases and I add things to them. They're historical. I add characters. I draw from stories in real life. I always find that real life is really kind of like where I feel most at home. Again, it's an extension of storytelling, right? Of my roots. Stories are are everything if you think about it, right? Everything.
Yeah, let me ask. 'Cause I don't want to get too
It's okay.
Freudian or therapist on you, but I wonder if now that we're talking about this, you're making me wonder if your love of stories is a way to keep your mother alive, to keep that spirit alive, the spirit of storytelling, the spirit of mystery,
Yeah.
creativity, con artist, you
Yeah, I
know.
think I think definitely not a conscious thing, but for sure, 1,000%, 1,000%. I mean, when I did No Parole, which is my solo show about my mom, I'm playing all the parts, right? So oh, this is gonna be, hopefully this is interesting to you, but I channel my mom. Like I perform as my mother in such a, for 10 years. So like when my brother and sister hear me do my mom, they're like, "Oh my God, it's mom." My mom passed away a couple of years ago. I I'm not a crazy person. I mean, a little bit crazy like everybody else, but I've been talking to my mom every day since the day she died, and she talks back. I'm not like it's like I don't know, like I want to start like writing about that because she talks back every single time, and I try to like sort of psychoanalyze it, and I think it's partly because I embodied my mom in this performance for 10 plus years, so I know what she sounds like, and I am adept at improvising. That's how I create most of my work. So it's a continuation of storytelling, and I call it writing on my feet. I get up and I start generating story, right? So I can do all those things. I could sound like my mom. I can generate story real easy, but she talks back to me and she always says things that are so unexpected.
Like what? What did she say to you? What did
I'll
she
tell
say
you what,
lately?
I was in the, I, so my mother's passing was probably like the hardest thing I'll ever experience, right? And yet I was so glad that I was there and all I was beautiful and sad, all those, the complexity of human emotions, right? And I was in the car in California and I was driving and I started crying, as you'll do, right? Because you love your mom and I was crying and, and she said, "Oh, yeah, 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 yeah." She just snapped at me a little bit, like, grow up a little bit. Like she mocked me for crying. I was like, oh my God, it's my mom. You know what I mean? It's so perfect. And again, it just I hear her so clearly. It's amazing. It's such a gift. And I don't know, my partner's mom just passed, and I keep telling him, talk to her. You won't hear her maybe, or maybe you will at some point. I don't know. But it's a continuation of stories, She keeps talking.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk a bit about how you got involved with Houses on the Moon and specifically with Real One as the director.
Yeah, so I've known Emily and Houses on the Moon. I was the first actor that they hired outside of Emily and Jeff, who are the artistic directors. We did a play called Building Houses on the Moon. And so that was like 30 somewhat years ago, I think. It's crazy. So I've known them for a very, very long time, worked on several different projects with them. And I just also just from doing theater in New York, I met Ian years ago doing a play, and it was interesting. I think I might have mentioned it to you when I met you. I didn't know about Ian's story, I didn't know about the significant moment in his and his family's life. And we're pretty close friends, so it was interesting to not like have known that about him. I don't want to give any spoilers away, so I want you to come and see it, right? Those who haven't seen it. But anyway, I had seen one of his incarnations where it was him doing a story. It was just straight up story. It wasn't a solo show. It was just a short story. And then I saw when they turned it into a four-actor show called Superhero, which was great. It was great. At the core, it was the same story, but it was just told in a different format.
Yeah, I saw that.
And
Yeah, it was
yeah,
terrific.
yeah, I thought it was great. It was great. And then somehow him and I had were talking, and I kept telling him about like the importance of that significant moment in that story, right? Because it's cathartic for an audience. It's a very deep human thing to go through, And I said to him, that's the most important part of that story. And we just kept having conversations, brief, social conversations. And then at some point he said, I want you to direct this next incarnation. And then House on the Moon got this incredible grant, and we were able to go into a rehearsal room for 2 weeks, which is really the joy of the work is being able to craft something, taking the time. And Ian is such a fantastic actor, so to be able to do that is just a joy. And yeah, that's how I got involved with it.
What are the challenges of being a director? For example, in directing in, what do you think are the challenges? How do you manage the relationship between the actor and the director? And
That's a great question. And I'm super, super lucky that Ian is such a wonderful actor. Because the biggest challenge is, as having been a director now for a very long time, casting is the most important part, as far as I'm concerned, of the process. Because if you don't do your job, or you are, is the wrong word, but duped into thinking that somebody can do something, and then all of a sudden they show up and then they're not delivering, that's the hardest part. Because you can be as creative as you want, but if they don't have the skill to be able to deliver, then that's really, 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 really hard. And I don't condone this, and I don't think it's a good idea. But with my company, with Live in Theater, I have fired people. I have fired people like before the show opens, because you can't not fire people if it's not working, because you get one person that doesn't work, the whole thing goes down the toilet, in my opinion. So you have to be really careful in the casting process. But Ian is a fantastic actor. Sometimes when you're dealing with highly emotionally very sensitive subject matter, you have to be very delicate, and I can be not in a bad way, but I move very quickly. I always feel like we never have enough time, and I move really quickly. So with Ian, I had to just a little bit. I had to be like really, really patient. And when things got very emotional, I had to just like be there for him 1,000%. I don't care what we see. I don't care what the play looks like. Are you okay? Checking in. I also use a lot of humor, and I use a lot of anecdotes, because we've all gone. One of the great things about being, in my 50s is that like anybody, and anybody in their 40s, I think, we've gone through enough stuff, all of us, right, that we can relate to pain, and being hypersensitive to when somebody needs space, so I think that's one of the challenges.
yeah, I just have another question or two. Whose story is it? Uh, Once it's done, or let me ask it another way. How have you influenced, as the director, the telling of a story?
That's a really great question. So, we did a lot of talkbacks at the end of the performances for Real One. And I almost like, sometimes when there were young people in the audience, and the great thing about Real One is that, I mean, you can have somebody in their 90s, and you can have somebody that's 8 years old, and they're going to enjoy it just as well, because it's cross universal. It just spans a very large age gap for the audience. Um, but I would often like, I always wanted to. It didn't happen. I'd want to ask the young people, especially, who knows what a director does. you know and I came up with this analogy, and I never did it, so it was all in my head, right? Like when a traffic light goes out, and there's somebody is controlling the traffic, directing the traffic. You go now, you stop, and you stay over there. That's basically what a director does. Control. It outlines how the story unfolds, the tempo at which, the blocking, all those things. It's always going to be his story, but it's told in such a way where I bring a lot of, my own creativity to it, and how it's told. That's where it's mine. but it's always his. It's always going to be his, especially because it's such a personal story, right? I don't have any ownership over it. I love it and I'm really proud of it, but it's his.
Well, I hope to see you on November 2nd when we're
Yes, I will do my best to be there.
yes. And I'd love to hear more about your work and where we can see it, where we can take be a part of your theater company.
Yeah, you can go to liveintheater.com. It's live, liveintheater.com. You can follow me on social media, Carlo D'Amore 1969, Instagram, and but I'm always around. You can always just Google me, you'll find me.
Okay, I'm gonna keep finding you. So great talking with you, Carlo. Just
Yeah.
it's just been a wonderful conversation, and I hope we will get a chance to talk again.
Likewise, Tony. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your night.